Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'll just read some brief words from this presentation and then we'll get a start. Can everybody hear well, or there's a bit of feedback? Yeah, there we go. Okay. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the first contemporary conversation of this year, a series of events engaging with contemporary visual cultures positioned to its present. In addition to convening this gathering, I have the great pleasure to thank your presence from the beginning, those here with us today, and this extends to showing our gratitude to the University of Nottingham, Nottingham Trent University, for generously and graciously supporting our events. To our colleagues for carving out the time to create a caring research environment here at the Contemporary. And in addition, I would like to acknowledge James Brower, who's our brilliant technician supporting us today, and Adep, who's our gallery assistant, also supporting us this evening. And of course, Café Otard for lending us these beautiful plants. Our gratitude also goes first and foremost to our speakers, Shela Sheikh and Michael Marder, who I will introduce in a short moment. The format of our conversation this evening is quite informal and welcomes questions and comments. Our speakers will share their individual presentations for about approximately 30-40 minutes, and this will be followed by 5 to 10 minutes questions for any concerns that directly relate to the presentations, and thereafter we have generous time for discussion. There will be 2 roving mics passing by, so feel free to raise your questions and comments. Some housekeeping notes, important. There's one fire exit to this space, which is on your left-hand side. There's also 2 toilets which are placed on the left, so on the exit to the right. I am sorry, I am dyslexic, so please forgive me. So on the right-hand side, feel free to take your time to go to the toilet in the middle of the event if necessary. Just walk in and out mindfully. Lastly, I'd like us to take our time to silence our mobile phones and just bring our awareness to the space. Well, acknowledging artists' role in neither coinciding nor departing from their time, but working with its passage, pressing and transforming it, the series of evening dialogues explores the present tense in its cultural and political dimensions, visual cultures, and post-colonial debates. Each dialogue aims to convene scholars, writers, thinkers, whose practice resonates with artistic research in ways that are rather oblique. These contemporary conversations traverse the artworks on view, expanding outwards into the world to ask urgent questions about things that cannot easily be pinned down. They are oblique points of entry, as Irit Rogoff would have it, that refuse the straightforward ones, reflecting on how artists have struggled with how discrete histories of identity, military and territorial conflict, differing experience of colonialism, and so forth, continue to shape worlds. This evening we'll explore vegetal life and our relenting uprooting from this world. Opposite to plants, whose existence is premised on retribution, arguably more than return, in the form of oxygen, roots, herbs, agricultural produce, and eventually fossilized forms of energy, European and Western thinking have brought us to a moment in time where we are no longer surrounded by forest, but rather by the immense, unfiltered, unabated light of the Enlightenment, casted by worldwide deforestation, human reason above all else. We are no longer canopied by overhanging trees, but by the possibility that everything has become a transparent glass architecture of our mind. 1 in every 5 plant species is currently on the brink of extinction. Landscapes and vegetation are still used as the backdrop against which colonial dispossession is mobilized, while the expansion of intensive agriculture and industrial settlement has contaminated, eroded, drained, burnt, flooded, and depleted the surface of our planet on a worldwide scale. In response to such offenses against the earth, can the root systems of plants, their paths, lines, traces, upwards and downwards, their offshoots, their seeds, their fertile compostable demise, illuminate the workings of capital and power, nature and culture? What does it mean to spend time with nature rather than in nature? I oftentimes find refuge in the forest, where life grows in all directions, also sideways towards me. Michael Marder, here with us today, has put it brilliantly, and I quote, "In being with plants, everything slows down to the pace of their growth. I find myself thus in communion with everything they are and live with, and I am together with myself differently. I become myself otherwise." Hence, it is in this slowdown that another cultivation of life is realized. I'll start by introducing Michael, to whom I'm indeed grateful for the many inspiring, albeit seldom, conversations over the years. In an extended letter exchange published in the book format with the well-known French feminist philosopher Lucie de Garay, Michael reveals, and I quote, "Whenever I'm invited to give a public talk on the subject of my vegetal research, I secretly hope that I might take place in the presence of both human and plants. I want my words and my writing to circle back to the trees and flowers, the shrubs and grass, even if they are addressed to fellow humans." Michael, we hope that the foliage we're in today can be a good interlocution. Michael is a philosopher based in Lisbon, whose long-term commitment to vegetality is the subject of various monographs and articles, including The Philosopher's Plant, an Intellectual Herbarium, Through Vegetal Being, Energy Dreams, among others. He is also Iker Basque Research Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Basque Country, and tonight he will be addressing how plants think, how are thinking about plants, and the dynamic interaction between the two, following onwards to how plants listen, our listening to plants, and the resonances between our auditory senses. It is important to position this conversation from the perspective of listening. Representation traces only a fine line between injustices done to others and the various violences that accompany speaking for them. As extinction is positioned in the dual respite between life and death, we must ask who is going to die and who is going to die first. While the problem of speaking for others continues to be a genuine conundrum in academia, the unrepresentable nature should ring a kind of post-colonial and feminist bell. In her landmark essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, Gayatri Spivak prefigures the discussion of political speaking on the behalf of others. 3 decades later, it is time for us to attune to the ways in which nature makes itself expressive. Who is entitled or ought to speak in the name of whom is one of the key concerns driving Shela Sheikh research in the context of environmental testimony. We have been inattentive to the sonorities of nature, to their claim to legal rights, to the slow, protracted ways in which disproportionate harm vegetable life has been witnessed to. In the onset of a 6th mass extinction event, this is a very difficult combination of 3 words, as enjoyable as 20 degrees weather has been, we must account for differential vulnerabilities, the ways in which race and class come into play in the making of our abilities and responsibilities in dealing with climate change. Shela will address the pitfalls of silence and the ways in which it is not differentiated from the vital construction of race and nature in modern colonial imaginaries. By returning to Daniel Stigman Mangrame's exhibition, I don't know if you've had the chance to see it. If not, feel welcome to visit over the weekend. But not only. Shela will be touching upon our past exhibitions and public programs, such as Rights of Nature in 2015, Ecologies of Value in 2013, foregrounding the long-term concerns of this institution. So Shela teaches in the Department of Media, Communications and Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths, University of London, where she convenes the MA in Postcolonial Culture and Global Policy and co-chairs the Goldsmiths Critical Ecologies research stream. In recent years, she has been working on a multi-platform research project around colonialism, botany, and the politics of planting. Shela is currently working on a book project that addresses nature, race, and more than human witnessing, some of which we will be addressing this evening. Without further ado, I would like to invite you to join me in join me in welcoming our speakers who will grace us with the words. Thank you. Thank you, Sofia, first of all. Thank you, Nottingham Contemporary, Carolina as well, and the technical crew. And it's a pleasure to be here in conversation with Michael. I think we're going to have some, hopefully, really beautiful resonances between the papers. So I'll begin, just to keep time. I want to begin with a quotation from the anthropologist Eduardo Kohn, from a conversation that he had with Daniel Steegman Mangrané in 2018. I'm actually not going to talk about Steegman Mangrané's work so much, but it's a kind of prompt, certainly, for thinking these issues through. So this is the text, which is actually available on his website, and I would recommend having a look at it. So with reference to his now seminal 2013 book, to enter into that world which is not made by us. And the way to enter is to listen. So it's the listening, not the speaking, that's important. You have to learn to open yourself to something that is not part of your world or way of thinking, end quote. So in what follows, I'll be circling around this notion of listening in terms of questions of voice, quote unquote, silencing and epistemological deafness, let's say, or blindness, as these pertain to the entanglement between human and non-human rights, and crucially, the complexities of representation, as Sofia already mentioned. So I have to admit that when I talk about listening, I'm using it in quite a sort of expanded, loose sense in terms of receptivity and openness. I think Michael will be talking much more specifically about listening as a sort of sensorial or a communicative form, and in relation to plants. So in many senses, I share with Steegman Mangrané a skepticism about representing nature. But I'll be addressing this from a slightly different and indeed a broader perspective, not so much in terms of the impossibility of representation, and this is something that the exhibition is sort of framed in terms of that impossibility, but more its ambiguities and its possible violences. So more specifically, in order to cut a path through an enormous field, I'll be approaching this through the prism of witnessing, or what we might name a testimonial constellation, or testimonial constellations in the plural, because they're always different and situated. So here I'm drawing from current work on nature, race, and environmental violence, as Sofia mentioned, and what I'm theorizing in current writing as more than human witnessing. So to give some context, my interest lies specifically in testimony from the perspective of both humans and non-humans. So the backdrop against which I'm speaking is that of neo-colonial environmental violence that's enacted globally against both racialized human bodies and against nature. And with this, the entanglement of abuses of human and non-human rights. So just to stress that entanglement. So for a start, violations of human rights have been and continue to be often carried out through the environment, through the natural environment. So for instance, through scorched earth tactics, environmental remodeling, planting, the creation of enclosures, and dispossession through land grabbing. So moreover, in the context of environmental racism, such violations are often enacted against racialized populations who are culturally and politically rendered disposable or sacrificable. So for instance, climate refugees or those denied access to water or drinkable water, exposed to higher levels of pollution and toxicity, or removed from their land in the name of the profitability of extractive capitalism. Or in a more sinister move,
removed from their land in the name of conservation. So what I'm interested in is the political silence of creatures and landforms that we call nature. And I'm using sort of invisible quotation marks whenever I use the word nature, the whole point being that there is no single stable nature. So landforms, creatures and landforms that we call nature, and the silencing that takes place where nature is treated as an object, so a resource without voice and without rights. Moreover, when nature is treated as an object that needs to be protected by humans, but only, importantly, by certain kinds of humans. So the question of who is entitled to or who ought to speak in the name of whom is one of my concerns. Above all, in the context of silencing and the constructed categories of the active and passive, or the subject and object, as these play out across race, nature, and shifting conceptions of the human. So often, as the anthropologist Leslie Green writes, who has the right to advocate for nature is profoundly racialized. She's writing from the South African context, but we could say the same in many different contexts. Since voices raised in the protection of nature have an uneasy time escaping the scripts of race and racism. So key here is the subject-object relation that must be read through the legacies of colonial categorization of forms of life, in which the violence that is racism functions through the classification of some as subjects who have the right to speak, and others who are silent, reduced to objects or things in a racial imaginary in which some people are reduced to the non-human, or less than human, classed as a lesser species. In other words, classed as closer to nature. So with respect to the figure of the witness, over the past few years, I've been struck by the appearance of terms referring to non-human entities as witnesses in the context of artworks. So for a start, many visual and literary works mobilize the idea of landscape or nature as an archive. And I'll just show two examples. There's many others I can discuss, but for the sake of time, I'll stick to these. So this is a work by Paulo Tavares and Ursula Biemann called Forest Law, which looks at the violent history of colonization and extractive capitalism in the context of what they call the earthly memory of the mud of the Ecuadorian Amazon. So, and this is something I'll be coming back to in a while. So in this case, it's not so much a metaphor, but there are many other artistic works where the idea of sort of nature as archive or nature as holding memory is mobilized. But there's a difference between speaking about archives as a kind of repository of information and traces and narratives and violations, and speaking about witnesses in terms of active subjects who narrate and express or relate events that have occurred to them. So another work that came to mind, these are more installation shots of Forest Law, is the work of Maria Teresa Alves, that's Seeds of Change. So this is an ongoing investigation based on original research of ballast flora in the port cities of Europe. It was actually in Liverpool some years ago. Sorry, Bristol. And more recently in New York City. She did basically a kind of colonial archaeology, a botanical archaeology of New York City. So materials such as stones, earth, wood, and bricks were used as ballast to stabilize merchant sailing ships according to the weight of the cargo. Upon arrival in port, the ballast was unloaded, carrying with it seeds native to the area where it had been collected. So the source of these seeds can be any of the ports in the regions and their regional trading partners involved in trade with Europe. And what struck me is that in the words of the late critic Jean Fisher, seeds here function as what she calls migration's silent witnesses. So the seeds themselves, as with the plant forms, become witnesses precisely where there are no human witnesses left to testify. So of course we can think about the sort of trade, of human trade as well. We can think about the global slave trade and the sort of transportation of goods. Fisher was actually speaking at the Rights of Nature conference here in 2015 that was already mentioned. So beyond what I believe to be the poetic generativity of such terms in the realm of metaphor, the witness, the archive, my question is, what does it mean to speak of nature as a witness? And can we speak in literal terms here? So this question drives a larger project in which I outline what I call the future of the witness. So I'm using this term in the grammar of the double genitive to refer to two things. So first of all, the idea that especially faced with climate change and environmental violence and environmental racism, there is a need to reconceptualize and critically and legally expand our understanding of the witness as we move into the future. And secondly, that rather than simply referring to past events, that we ask whether and how witnessing might function in both the present and the future. So leaving aside this temporal or futural aspect for the purposes of this evening, I'll just state that I'm arguing that where what is demanded is collective action, the witness can no longer be a solitary figure. So rather the witness must be but one of many within a collectivity. So moreover, it's precisely in the context of a collectivity that the witness figure is produced, inscribed within a particular social and, of course, we can say ecological milieu. So inscribed within a relational testimony or testimonial constellation. So although the figure of the witness has traditionally been confined to the human, where what is at stake is care for both human and non-human or more than human life, witness collectivities need necessarily entail an expansion beyond the category of the human. So just to be clear, I'm not proposing that nature itself be conceived as witness, strictly speaking, insofar as this would entail a risk of anthropomorphism, so a risk of sort of granting nature the status of the human witness. So rather my argument is that witnesses are produced in the context of more than human socialities between the human and the non-human. So I'm by no means the first to propose that the figure of the witness be extended beyond the human. In the legal context, and this was the subject of the exhibition and the conference in 2015 here on the rights of nature. So in the legal context, practices and theorizations of non-human rights, or the rights of nature, and with this shifting conceptions and categories of personhood, legal standing, as well as voice, have done much to make nature inhabit the courtrooms of national and transnational forums as potential witnesses of legal violations. So there are notable references, for instance, the work of Susan Schuppli, and I'm going to come back to her work, who since 2005, both through art practice and theoretical writings, has been developing the idea of the material witness. So this is an operative concept that foregrounds what she calls the expressive qualities of non-human matter and demonstrates how media artifacts and environmental conditions themselves bear witness not only to events, but also to the sorting and the registration processes that are imposed upon them in order for them to qualify as evidence in the first place. And she's asking how, and this in a work like this one, which I'll return to, she's asking how objects and environments are made to speak as witnesses to crimes and violations. So Schuppli's work was formative for another important reference, this being the forensic aesthetics, upon which the work of the Goldsmith-based research group, Forensic Architecture, or it's now an agency, which arose in the context of the fallibility of human testimony, is based. So in the absence of reliable human witnesses, forensic aesthetics turns instead to the agency of matter, be it organic or inorganic, including natural environments, or to object witnesses to question factual reality as expressed by the state. So as mentioned, in conceiving of nature as witness, we run the risk of anthropocentrism. And well-intentioned gestures of advocacy, so of speaking for or giving voice, as Sofia already mentioned, knowingly or inadvertently entail the possibility of silencing. So as the feminist scholar of environmental humanities, Astrida Naimanes states in an article entitled No Representation Without Colonization, the warnings posed by Gayatri Spivak in her seminal 1988 essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, prove as prescient as ever, albeit in Naimanes' reading relating to different forms of subaltern. So in this case, we now see the dangers of speaking for and misrepresenting not only humans, more often than not indigenous subjects, but also nature. So as Spivak had famously asserted, attempts to represent the subaltern are often predicated upon an epistemic violence that constitutes the colonial of subject as other. Spivak points to the blindness of French post-structuralist thinking regarding the implications of imperialism in this epistemic violence. In short, if, as Spivak tells us, the subaltern cannot speak, this has everything to do with their addressee or their spokesperson, in our context, not being able to hear. So in Spivak's words, it's important to acknowledge the Western and post-colonial theorists or academics' complicity in the muting of the subaltern. As anthropologist Rosalind Morris writes, the corollary question to that of whether the subaltern can speak, i.e., how can we learn to listen, remains radically open. So in Naimanes' reading, things are pushed to the extreme and the conundrum remains as to whether any form of representation, however well-intentioned, necessarily involves at least some form of colonization. So a rendering passive or mute or a silencing. So representation, especially in the defense of the rights of nature, remains what she calls an impossible necessity, an experience of being trapped between what, and I think she puts it nicely here, she calls a representationalist rock and a hard place of complicit silence. So practically speaking, there are various manners through which we might think this can't but must paradox, or the impossible necessity of representing non-humans. So to be clear, Spivak does not suggest that we do away with representation altogether. And in the context of environmental violence, this is also certainly not an option. So I'm not suggesting that nature be retrieved and ushered into the category of the subject. Rather, maybe we can complicate that, but not in a simplistic manner. So rather that we remain attentive to the possible mechanisms of silencing between the two senses of representation that Spivak reminds us of in German. And this is like a lot of the essay is sort of spinning upon the mistranslation of Marx in German. So she talks about representation in terms of Vertreten, so the art of persuasion or rhetoric, in terms of the political proxy, and then representation as Darstellung, so a tropology or an aesthetic representation, a representation as portrait. And I think this is something we can maybe talk about more in terms of artistic practices that sort of move between the two. So we need to be attentive to the sort of possibilities of misrepresentation between those two. But nature does, despite all these sort of problematics in terms of speaking for or representing nature, we need to acknowledge that nature does, in fact, represent itself. So for a start, we know that vegetal life has highly complex means of communication, which is something to which I'll return in the context of the forest. So Naimanes speaks of nature's capacity to right itself. So she looks at ice and water's capacity to materially register traces, and as such to destabilize any rigid boundary between nature and culture. So one as passive, inert matter, there to be consumed and rendered transparent. The other, the consumer, the renderer. As Shupri's work shows, in particular the series Slick Images and Nature Represents Itself, environments themselves are expressive. I'll explain these images. They're expressive. So polluted environments, for instance, contain vast photosensitive surfaces that register and record the changes caused by modern industrialization. So this can be mobilized by the practice of forensis, in which such traces are read and narrated by the, be it expert or non-expert witness, in the quest for accountability and exposure. So to elucidate in the two series, Slick Images and Nature Represents Itself, in both works, Shupli analyzes the Deepwater Horizon oil spill of 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. And so you have sort of typical mediatic, extreme images of the event, arguing through the artworks and the accompanying commentary that the oil slick itself, beyond external images, so these being the satellite images or the media images from nearby, that the oil slick itself, beyond the images of the spill, it operationalized an independent mode of cinema as what she names a slick image. And these are underwater images. So we've got the sort of difference between images that are being taken from without and the sort of environment itself producing its own image. So this is part of the slick images that she's talking about. She's done sort of re-renderings of the oil spill. So for Shupli, the cinematic capacity of the oil spill is a feature of its very ontology, its molecular structure and its behavior. As such, the oil slick can be understood as engaged in the production of a new form of cinema, organized by the found footage of nature itself. So the conditions that brought about the disaster are thus re-expressed as an ontological rearrangement of molecular matter, a shift from the representation of the damaged drilling rig and its gushing crude to the actualization of a ruinous image. So a further example would be, these are more stills from the rendering that she produced of the oil slick. So a further example would be Jennifer Gabris's work on sensing lichens, which, although based in the putative West, engages with many key post- and decolonial representational quagmires. So Gabris is principal investigator on the London-based Citizen Sense project, which investigates the relationship between technologies of environmental sensing and citizen, i.e. non-expert, engagement. So this particular project concerns bioindication, a process by which environmental pollution registers in the bodies, inhabitations, and relations of organisms. So Gabris's project opens up a number of avenues that are relevant to a potential reconceptualization of the witness. So first of all, that of the speech of the no longer simply human witness. So rather than mobilize the metaphor of a nature that speaks, as is common in environmental campaigns, for instance, this hugely problematic project where elements of nature are ventriloquized by famous movie stars, Gabris instead refers to lichens as bioindicators, as such avoiding anthropomorphizing nature or the granting of rights or voice to the non-human. So secondly, back to the lichens. Secondly, Gabris's focus on speculative engagements challenges the notion of any given organism, be it a witness or otherwise, as an individual, and stresses how what constitutes human, quote unquote, is not a fixed entity, but can shift in relation to different milieux. She's drawing on the work of Simondon's notion of individuation here. So drawing from Alfred North Whitehead and Isabel Stenger's, speculative for Gabris signals, quote, the distributed capacity of organisms and environments to generate new modes of encounter together with new propositions for ways of being. So thirdly, in her emphasis on lichens as environmental subjects and participants in collective communities engaged in multi-species world-making projects, Gabris provides a useful point of orientation in debates around representation through the notion of perspective. So environmental sensing is here approached from a shift in perspective, with the task being, quote, to consider how these inverted modes might open up other approaches to environmental conflict by encountering pollution from the point of view of other organisms, end quote, and through other organisms' accounts, quote unquote. So importantly for the post or the decolonial context, Gabri's argues that bioindication through these multiplying points of view also demonstrates how nature itself is not a stable referent. So rather, drawing from Eduardo Viveros de Castro's book Cannibal Metaphysics, nature can in fact be understood, quote, as a realm where diversity multiplies towards a multinaturalism, where organisms might also be approached as persons and as having perspectives as persons. So it's in this sense that a new politics might begin to take shape. So Viveros de Castro's work has been formative for the work of Paulo Tavares and Ursula Beeman, which I already showed earlier on, Forest Law. So this multimedia installation, included in the Rights of Nature exhibition here in 2013, is based on long-term research into the Ecuadorian Amazon as a site of conflict between the Quichua people of the Sarayaku and the oil industry. So in the work, we see how the Quichua turned to the courts of law, for instance, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, in order to make claims for the protection of the environment they inhabit. So the landmark case, Quichua Indigenous People of Sarayaku versus Ecuador, was vital for the rights of nature that were subsequently introduced into the Ecuadorian Constitution in 2008. And there are many extracts from the testimonies that are in publications that accompany the project. For instance, there's one publication here. I've left out the image. So as Tavares and Beeman demonstrate, the forest court, as they call it, deeply rooted as it is in situated histories of colonial violence, is an exemplary space for, quote, calling for the constitution of a universalist, multi-species politics beyond the human, end quote. And this politics, to evoke the title of this evening's event and the planning therein, is decidedly spatial and perspectival, almost we could say architectural. So I quote them. They say, if modern sciences are based on an incremental process of objectification of reality, Amerindian sciences are based on the art of perspectivism, a mode of perceiving and engaging with the world as a multiplicity of worlds instead of a single object unity. And then further on, they state, in contrast to Western cosmology, where the social is restricted to the domain of the human species, in Amerindian thought, the space between humans and non-humans, people and nature, is from the outset a socialized space. So Tavares and Beeman quote from Viveros de Castro and Deborah Danowski's co-authored book, The Ends of the World, which I gloss from. So they write how we, i.e. those of us who are embedded within Western cosmology, may think, or may like to think, that it is only possible to be human in society, that man is a political animal, and so on. But what we, quote unquote, call the environment is for Amerindian thought a society of societies, an international arena, a cosmopolitea. So what we would call the natural world is for Amazonian peoples a multiplicity of intricately connected multiplicities, in which animals and other species are conceived of as people or societies, i.e. as political entities. So it's not simply that the jaguar, for instance, is human, quote unquote. It is an individual jaguar. It is individual jaguars that take on a subjective dimension, precisely when they are being perceived as having behind them a society, a collective political alterity. So recalling my introduction about race, nature, and the subject-object relation, we read, There is therefore no absolute difference in status between society and environment, as if the first were subject, society, and the second, environment, the object. Every object is another subject and is more than one, end quote. So furthermore, as Tavares and Lehman write, such a conception of the forest as a cosmopolitea implies that every being that inhabits the forest, so be it trees, jaguars, peoples, are some sort of city dwellers. That is, that they are citizens within an expanded polity formed by complex material and symbolic ties between nature and between society and nature. So the nature of nature is social, and hence the ways that we imagine, relate to, and represent nature, whether in the forums of art or law, are fundamentally political. So the forest is a polis, the political arena where both the concepts of human and rights are being defined. So this view of the forest as a polis is explored further by Tavares in various texts. For instance, in the essay In the Ruins of Amazonia, this is the publication of theirs, and in a contribution to the publication, The Word for World is Still Forest, and I think this is just a publication worth noting, edited by Anna-Sophie Springer and Etienne Turpin. And the book, which is a kind of exhibition publication, is a reference to Ursula Le Guin's 1972 novella, The Word for World is Forest. So Tavares shows how the forest... I'll stay there. Tavares shows how the forest, so the supposedly natural, non-urban environment without history, is in fact a designed construction that results from the various ways that indigenous societies engage, manipulate, and transform the land. So this, of course, is contrary to the standard cartographic interpretations, Western, colonial, that portray the Amazon as an undisturbed environment. So recalling my earlier mention of an expanded sense of listening and a possible deafness and silencing, Tavares shows how this optical blindness in mapping is to a large extent the spatial correlative of an epistemological myopia that has historically conditioned the ways in which modern sciences have interpreted the nature of Amazonia. So before concluding, I'd just like to return briefly to the work of Eduardo Kohn, who I quoted at the outset. So if, as I mentioned earlier on, the figure of the witness is produced in a testimonial constellation, a study such as Kohn's is exemplary for conceiving of different species or forms of life as deeply entangled and mutually constitutive. So Kohn's work, although not by any means relieving us of the problems that I began to set out regarding representation, provides an interesting alternative framework. As he says, he spent much of his time during fieldwork, his ethnographic work, trying to listen, often with a tape recorder in hand, to how people in everyday contacts relate to their experiences with different kinds of beings. So the interlocutors here were usually human, I'm quoting from him, and usually runa. But conversation, quote unquote, also occasionally involved other kinds of beings. So the squirrel cuckoo who flew over the house, whose call so radically changed the course of discussions down below. The household dogs with whom people sometimes need to make themselves understood. The woolly monkeys and the powerful spirits that inhabit the forest, and even the politicians who trudge up to the village during election season. With all of these, people in Avila struggle to find channels of communication. So to put things straightforwardly, as we are told by the voiceover in the Forest Law film, which draws from Kohn's book as well as Michel Serres' book, The Natural Contract, and James Lovelock's book, The Revenge of Gaia, we hear and we see through the subtitles, the forest lives and thinks. We humans are not the only ones who interpret the world. All living beings do. They continuously interpret and represent the world around them. Life is semiotic. All living beings think. So acknowledging that other beings represent the world through their thinking changes our understanding of human exceptionality. Drawing from the philosopher Charles Peirce's work on semiotics, Cohn attempts, quote, to situate representation in the workings and the logics of a broader non-human universe out of which we humans come, end quote. So representation in Cohn's analysis is more expansive than various social theories' understanding of it. So be these humanist, post-humanist, structuralist, post-structuralist. So rather, inspired by Frank Salomon's work on the representational logics of Amazonian knotted cords, and Janice Nuckel's work on Amazonian sound images, Cohn explores representational forms that go beyond language and beyond the human, as such forcing a radical reconceptualization of the task of anthropology itself, hence the subtitle, An Anthropology Beyond the Human. So of course this we can fold back through my earlier discussion about the sort of witness figure and whether we can call nature witness in terms of its linguistic capacities and its expressive and representational capacities. So to conclude, we might recall Gabris's evocation of world-making and speculative practices. So with a rich heritage in feminist technoscience, this, quote, allows for certain subjects and relations to gain a foothold, end quote. So just as the rights of nature are only in part about what we know as, quote unquote, nature, such world-making practices are formed across species. So rather than rights, voice, or membership of an environmental public being extended or granted to non-humans, persons, i.e. co-witnesses, are produced perspectively in and by situated relations between humans and non-humans. So with regard to Cohn's anthropology beyond the human, the words of Anna-Sophie Springer and Etienne Tepin are prescient, as they write in the introduction to an interview with Cohn that is included in the publication I mentioned earlier, The Word for World is Still Forest. Quote, while the post-natural regime of the industrialized forest turns a complex ecosystem into an object that's measured, parsed, and standardized for human purposes on a grand scale, the animated forest that's mediated by Cohn reminds us that other worlds are not only possible, but that they already exist.
Yes, thank you very much, Sofia and Carolina, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you here at the Contemporary and to be in conversation with Shela as well. We discovered that there are lots of points of contact and really resonances between our approaches. What I would like to do today is touch upon three areas related to plants: plant thinking, plant perceiving, and plant listening. And show how each of them is nestled really within the others. As I was listening to Shela's talk, it occurred to me that listening itself is a kind of contradictory activity, and it comes through at the philosophical or theoretical level. So that for Hegel, the hearing sense is one of those ideal distance senses together with vision. In order to be able to do it well, there has to be enough of a distance between us and the stimulus. If it's too close, we won't hear anymore. And so it's ranked high up there in the hierarchy of the senses. And music, among the arts that corresponds to it, is one of those higher arts on this kind of teleological hierarchical scale. On the other hand, listening is a kind of sense that renders us passive. Not only passive, but we cannot initially, as babies, we cannot prevent it. I mean, a baby can close her eyes, but cannot really shut her ears. So it's a sense that is permeated, that is so receptive. All of our senses are receptive, but the sense of hearing is so receptive that it opens the being who hears up to the world. So already in and of itself, it has this contradictory structure of the highest, most ideal of senses, distant senses, Hegel calls it, and on the other hand, something that is so intimately close that invades and almost penetrates the baby's ear to the extent to which the baby cannot shut it out. This is Freud's position, actually. And so this paradox for me is important exactly because the hypothesis I would like to venture with you today regarding thinking, plant thinking and thinking in general as well, is that to think is to juggle the extremes. This would be, speaking about definitions, that this would be my definition of thinking. To think is to juggle the extremes, living with and in their mutual contradiction, in the proverbial excluded middle of formal logic. So this, what formal logic excludes is where everything actually happens, where life happens, where growth happens, in the middle between the extremes. And thinking happens there as well. To think is to be able to juggle those extremes from the excluded middle. And it immediately follows from this hypothesis that logic does not think, because it has to exclude the middle, right? And here I'm paraphrasing Heidegger's diagnosis in what is called thinking, where he says science does not think. And this is a quote from him. And on the contrary, who can perform the balancing act better and with more dedication and self-abandon than a plant, the balancing act of thinking? Relevant as such phenomena are, I'm not just referring to the simultaneous germination of a seed upwards and downwards, toward the light and toward the dark moistness of the soil. So plants are master thinkers in the sense in which they live in and with this contradiction. They live in two worlds at the same time, at least in two worlds, below ground and above ground, in the dark and in the light. Right, and so they have to juggle the extremes in that sense. They have to think, at least in this sense. But this is not the only thing I'm referring to. Nor am I alluding to how vegetal life spans the polar opposites of the elemental world, the earth and the sky, and in a sense keeps the elements together, prevents them from falling apart or falling out with themselves. What I have in mind in relation to the plan part of our title, what I have in mind is the coincidence of rigor and pliability in the plant that requires the support of cellulose cell walls and the stability of the trunk or the stem to lift it up, as much as the pliability of the leaf and the petal, not to mention the probing sensitivity of root tips to explore the place where it grows and to open itself up to the outside. So if formal logic was the system of rigidity, of mineral-like rigidity that passed itself for thinking, this is not thinking, because to think we need a certain, to some extent, rigid structure, but we also need the pliability and the nimbleness as well. That is precisely what thought is: rootedness and movement, structure and process, being in place and displacement. In a word, thought is growth. I have just asserted in the same breath that to think is to juggle the extremes and that thought is growth. How to reconcile these two statements? How to balance them in thought? But then, isn't growth itself a precarious balancing act, always on edge, rather than the relentless expansion or quantitative augmentation we've come to associate it with in modernity? Right? When we think of economic growth, it's always more of the same, an augmentation of value, an increase of a homogeneous quantity. And it's a very impoverished notion of growth. It draws on a certain, let's say, natural phenomenon, but really impoverishes it and reduces it to a single dimension. Sustainable growth, for instance, does not crave more and more, but rather revolves around knowing when to stop expanding and for how long. And plants are sustainable growers exactly in the sense in which they have to juggle, they have to balance the demands of the reproductive phase, which is inversely proportional in its energy investment to the vegetative growth. So when plants are about to start reproducing flowering varieties, when they have to put all of that energy into flowering, they stop their vegetative increase, the growth of actual leaves and branches and so on. So they have to juggle these two extremes of growth as well. Plant thinking depends on working with the contradictory demands of growth and reproduction that at the functional level correspond to a need for balance in the qualities of vegetal rigidity and nimbleness. The kind of dumb increase in matter that provides us with our uncritical conception of growth, particularly in the plant kingdom, is a figment of theoretical imagination. Even the fast and desperate elongation of the stem, eager to grow out of the shade and stretching toward the light, is far from unintelligent. The life and death juggling act it performs allows it to leave the danger zone, albeit at the price of the vibrancy and robustness of what grows actually out of that shade, because what grows out is a pale and feeble stalk and leaves. The ultimate extremes thinking must navigate are the thinker's self and its other. Cognition is not the purely interior endeavor philosophers have taken it to be, at least since Descartes. When we think about thinking, we think it's this inner monologue or the inner act of representing something to ourselves. But there's nothing purely inward about it. As soon as one brushes aside that privatized image of thought, itself economically complicit, right? So this privatization of thought arises in a certain economic system and structure. Once we brush it aside, it becomes clear, both in the philosophical and biological evolutionary registers, that thinking is an ongoing negotiation, a dialogue or a plurilogue with the world, over and above or below a symbolically or linguistically mediated discussion. So it's a dialogue, but not necessarily linguistically mediated. The structure of thinking is a conversation, and hence nothing stable, a construction in flux, invalidating the traditional distinction between structure and function, or structure and dynamics. As for plants, they think at the edges of their bodies, at the surface of leaves, across their meristems, or at the tips of the roots around which transition zones form that are home to fungi, bacteria, and other microorganisms that are engaged in these polymorphously perverse exchanges of information and other symbiotic exchanges. Symbiotic and biosemiotic. We touched upon this notion of biosemiotics, which is beyond linguistic representation. It's very clear that these exchanges at the transition zones around plant roots, where multiple species collaborate and cooperate, are biosemiotic exchanges conducted in these zones, and these exchanges enable the roots to pursue an intelligent course of growth toward the most fertile and water-rich patches of soil, that is, to think with others, in collaboration with others, plant and not non-plant others, encountering them at the threshold of the self, constitutively open to them. So to think in this way is ultimately to juggle the extremes of self and other. Thinking, we might say, happens on the brink where polar opposites, for instance the self and its other, stare each other in the face and are brought into a relation by the thinker-juggler who is neither and both self nor and other. Plants, in turn, are the multiplicities of such brinks or thresholds at their outer physical limits, as much as in every one of their semi-autonomous parts. So we were talking about the forest, but I was going to say that every plant in and of itself is already a forest, right? This is what it means to question the individuality, the unicity of a plant. A plant is a multiplicity of semi-autonomous growths, is already in and of itself a forest. So a forest is a forest of forests, as you were saying, a society of societies in the Meridian way of thinking, which means that plants are the most intensely thinking beings imaginable. Assessed in terms of the firing of neuronal synapses, thinking similarly foregrounds the in-between, the intervals, the clefts separating the neurons that pass electrical or biochemical signals to one another. The more synaptic branches and by implication clefts there are, the more potent cognitive activity becomes. And my colleague, a plant scientist from the University of Bonn, František Baluška, is actually quite interested in this vegetalized image of the nervous system, right? So the neurons are the most vegetal cells, even morphologically by their appearance, the most vegetal cells in our bodies. And they have all of these branches that actually the more branched a neuron, the more thinking activity there is, right? Which leads us to certain conclusions about plants and thinking as well. So plant vegetal growth provides the model for neuronal arborization and is not at all different from this intensification of thinking. When auxiliary branches and lateral roots emerge, a plethora of opportunities arise for a plant to inhabit the intermediate space between itself and its milieu. So the idea is that we live and think, and plants live and think, in this intermediary space between self and other, between the thinker and its or her or his milieu. And the more branches, the more of these opportunities arise as well. These interfaces, proliferating thanks to modular growth that reiterates existing plant structures in a deceptively redundant process, are the spatial representations of a cognition that no longer obeys the Cartesian distinction between the extended thing and the thinking thing. So we have left completely this privatized image of a thinker immersed in the thinker's own inner world, in the interiority of a monologue in one's head. If structuration is unsurpassable, then Hannah Arendt's suggestion to think without banisters is simply unacceptable. Thinking happens nowhere but on the banisters, on these edges of being. To be sure, they are somewhat peculiar, our banisters, made not of dead wood, not of timber, but of the living trees that, thinking their way through the world, open the possibilities for thinking to formerly non-vegetal animal and human beings. When Arendt recommends removing the protections that guarantee the thinker's security, this is what's at stake in her suggestion to think without banisters. It's this abandoning the safety zone, the security of thinking. And this word, too, is, of course, prevalent in contemporary political discourses, in the name of which terrible violations of human and non-human existences are justified, this word security. When she recommends thinking without banisters, without the secure comfort zone, she beseeches her readers to take the risk embedded in genuine thinking. But isn't a life lived within the dynamic structure of unresolved, irresolvable contradictions, that is to say, the life of juggling the extremes, highly perilous in its own right? Insofar as a plant juggles the competing demands of growth and reproduction, what is above and what is below, itself and the others, it lives and thinks, or it lives things, hyphenated, dangerously, always on the brink. The freedom of vegetal thought, vegetal life thought, is not indeterminate, even though it troubles the polar opposites between which the plant stretches out, setting their structure in motion. Between non-theological salvation and perdition, thinking is a risk worth taking. And the alternative is worse, it's much worse. The greatest risk is not taking risks, which is what our neoliberal logic tries to convince us with all of its risk analysis and assessments. At the level of their species beings, plants know this exceptionally well, which is why they have lived and thought both more extensively and more intensely than we humans have. Section 2 is on perceiving. So plant thinking, now plant perceiving. There is nowadays a growing scientific consensus that plants detect variations in their environment, from changes in light to humidity gradients, from graviotropism, or the pull of gravity determining the upward growth of shoots and the downward extension of roots, to different kinds of touch. So this is beyond dispute, that they are highly sensitive to over 20 environmental factors and conditions. Yet the bone of contention, which the scientific community is unlikely to chew anytime soon, is the so-called question of plant intelligence. Can plants think? Do their capacities amount to more than a hodgepodge of biosensors? Or, to put it slightly differently, are they adapted not only for perception, but also for cognition? In the conclusion to his influential book, What a Plant Knows, Daniel Chamovitz, who is a plant scientist, veers on the side of caution. Although he is happy to talk about plant awareness and a lot of things plants know, on matters of intelligence, Chamovitz remains unconvinced. According to him, since plants have no brain, cannot suffer, and are unable to engage in a two-way flow of meaning with us, and this is his term, two-way flow of meaning with us, every attempt to attribute intelligent behavior to them is doomed to an anthropomorphic hyperbole. I will not puzzle over blatant oversights, unforgivable even to a non-philosopher, of postulating the existence of knowledge and awareness without thinking, or of conflating anatomical structures, in this case the brain, the central nervous system, with the functions that they perform, here cognition. I will instead, and this is an important point for me, so we have to decouple in our minds structures from functions. We always, when we think of an eye, we think of vision. So beings that have an eye can see. Those that don't have an eye cannot see. This is absolutely wrong. It's absolutely wrong both in the case of perceiving and in the case of thinking. We think if a being has a brain, then it's a thinking being, right? But it is nothing but a conflation of a structure and a function. The same function can be performed in the same manner, if not better, using other anatomical structures, and we'll get to this in the case of plants. I will instead take up a more difficult issue with Chamovitz, namely the co-imbrication of thinking and perceiving. And I don't think that there is really a huge difference between the two. So that perceiving is already thinking. We cannot perceive anything, like this glass of water. I cannot perceive it without thinking, without already interpreting, attributing meaning to it. I do not see a transparent blob, but I see it already as a meaningful thing. Therefore, thinking is ingrained in perception. Beyond the world of plants as well, the meaning of thinking, which I have associated in the beginning with the ability to juggle the extremes, is pending clarification. And mine was a first attempt at, an initial attempt at this clarification. If this process involves nothing but abstract intellection achieved through a more or less proficient manipulation of concepts, then there is no doubt that non-human beings, and many humans to boot, do not take part in it, right? If thinking is nothing but abstract intellection, it is a purely human activity, and in fact many humans are also excluded from it. Conceptual thought is, however, exceptionally restrictive. The confinement of thinking to conceptuality intended above all to maintain and reinforce the already threadbare mind-body split and its attendant inequalities. The mind thinks while the body senses translates into the human thinks while the non-human at best senses, and further into some humans think while others only sense. Right? All of these statements, mistranslations, crude mistranslations, belong together. In the same violent gesture, the dogmatic heritage of Cartesian skepticism expels thinking beings from their bodies, that philosophically speaking have little that is inherently human about them in our case, renders ontological the class and racial divisions among human groups, particularly as they relate to the division of labor between its manual and intellectual modalities, and banishes other living beings, non-human, other than human living beings, from the sphere of cognition. Having been segregated from the rest of corporeality, thinking is concentrated in the brain, leaving behind body machines, automata that move by virtue of a decision-making core located in the head. But more recently, and curiously enough, the brain itself has fallen prey to machine logic. With thinking treated as a set of algorithmic operations, the control and command center, which is the brain, becomes a sophisticated computing device. Perception is reduced to a series of inputs, the data procured from the outside world, while thinking is information processing. We all recognize in this caricature the way that thinking is treated nowadays. Thinking is information processing, which yields variable outputs, that is, a plethora of possible responses to the same stimuli, derived from the inputs of perception. But this development, reductionist and really crudely reductionist as it is, has in turn unexpectedly contributed to an extension of the capacity to think to plants. As my colleague from the University of Murcia, Francisco Calvo Garzón, argues, plants resort to complex algorithmic procedures in order to calculate, for instance, optimal blossoming time. So they constantly calculate. And if thinking is calculating, if thinking is this algorithmic operation, then plants clearly also think. Unexpectedly, a generalized scientific reductionism glistens with redemptive potential. Brushing the metaphysical mind-body split away, it subsumes the mind under the very machine logic previously reserved for the body, and so democratizes algorithmically determined thinking, which it now also attributes to other than human life forms. While it dehumanizes the human, its methodology endows plants, animals, and colonies of bacteria with intelligence. As you must have realized, however, I do not want to equate thinking to certain mathematical functions. My phenomenological point of departure is that the body itself thinks by relating to its world and to itself. Perhaps to take another stab at a definition, thinking is this complex relation, which I have called juggling the extremes, that includes the two-way street of perception, the preeminent passageway for the body's openness to the world and the world's interpretation by the body, whether human, animal, plant, or microbial, for instance. In order to be effective, the double relationality of a living extension must involve a conjunction of external and internal stimuli, and it must be also primed for deciphering and making sense to the organism in question. Hence this perspectivalism. Perspectivalism, the perspective of every living being, means that it makes sense of itself and its world, so that its perception, what it gets from the world through perception, is already comes interpreted, right? Comes pre-interpreted almost. But the acts of lived hermeneutics do not happen a posteriori, once the signals emanating from the outside have struck their recipient. This is the mistake of the information processing model that has been ingrained in our heads by now. As phenomenological philosophy has shown time and again, sight, sounds, tactile impressions, etc., do not arrive shorn of meaning. They come pre-understood as the sun setting over the sea, the blowing wind, or the touch of someone's hand. Perceiving, as such, is a manner of thinking, juggling the extremes of the visible and the invisible, the infrared and the ultraviolet, the audible and the inaudible, the rough and the smooth. And plant perceiving is inherently plant thinking. Of course, important differences exist between human and vegetal modes of perceiving and therefore thinking. A plant will interpret the rays of the setting sun in a manner different from the human, for instance, by taking them as a cue for seasonal changes and the growing or diminishing length of daylight. The sensations a plant receives from its environment are not framed as objects, even though they continue to carry meaning for the perceiving, thinking body in question. And this is where the representational logic comes to its end or to its limit. So plant perception is not framed in terms of objects. Representation is a particular relation between subjects and objects, a particular historical framing that might not even be adequate for the way humans operate, let alone animals and plants. There is no place for representation in the vegetal world, only for the presence of light, pressure, vibrations, and so forth on the extension of the leaf or at the root, at the tip of the root, and yet a presence that comes with an interpretation. So it's an interpreted presence, but not a representation. Plant cells and tissues are the direct sites of inscription for events in the environment, and at the same time, the loci of interpretation concerned with the consequences these events hold in store. So they are the archives, the sites of inscription, and the sites of interpretation at the same time to play with this more active and more passive role of witnessing that you were talking about, Shela. Far from a deficiency, this too has been the holy grail of phenomenology. In the German tradition, Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger all railed against theories of picture thinking, this representational thinking that as if I have a picture of this cup in my brain, and that's what lets me understand what it is. Or the construal of perception as an inner photograph-like representation of external reality. While in France, Henri Bergson decried modern philosophy's impoverished approach to the world, chopped up into isolated objects. Plant thinking, like the thinking of our own bodies, is neither conceptual nor pictorial. It is the non-theoretical contemplation of the world, a contemplation that does not keep itself separate from the contemplated, but is active and engaged, sensuous and interpretive. The idea which may be gleaned from it is that thinking is not only thinking within the narrow limits of abstract cognition or judgment, and that the dynamism of thought is indebted to this excess of thinking with respect to itself, this non-identity of thinking with itself and its intimate bond to perception. So if I'm saying that perception is already thinking, there is something more to thinking than thinking narrowly understood. There is this excess of thinking over itself. Formulaically expressed, thinking is not equal to thinking. Such a non-identity is the exact opposite of the algorithms that contemporary scientific reductionism loads it with. That unequal sign is where the freedom of plants and our own takes refuge, in this non-identity of thinking with itself. And finally, in conclusion, very brief remarks on listening as it relates to plants in particular. To recap, plant thinking is a term that is not cognitive, or at least not just cognitive, revolving around the non-identity of vegetal being. As I put it already in plant thinking, it flies in the face of the insanity of transcendent thought. It thinks then in the immanence of existence, in this excluded middle, right? The immanence of existence, that is to say, the excluded middle that does not belong to either of the extremes and that at the same time belongs to both of them. With and as the other, juggling the extremes of the self and the other, including the selfhood and the otherness of thought itself. There is no strict distinction between thinking and feeling, thinking and sensing, thinking and being, thinking and living here. Plant thinking turns out inside out into plant seeing, plant listening, plant touching. And what I propose is that we together examine the seemingly strange case of plant listening. By definition, the rules of plant thinking apply to it as well. If plant thinking is simultaneously the thinking of the plants themselves, our thinking about plants, and the dynamic interaction between these two poles of the event, then plant listening is how the plants themselves listen, our listening to them, and the resonance of their and our auditory attentions. So first, the listening of the plants themselves. And this is contentious even in scientific literature. Are plants capable of listening? Do they have a sense of hearing? Obviously, without recognizable ears, and this is where we come back to this distinction between structures and functions, anatomical structures and functions that might be served by other means. Obviously, without recognizable ears, plants are all ears. The vegetal body or bodies, the proliferation of these semi-autonomous growths or forests within the one plant, the vegetal body attuned to the minutest vibrations above and below ground. To be all ears, as the idiomatic expression goes, is to be exceptionally attentive. I'm all ears, I'm very attentive to you, right? Open to others and to the world. Plants exhibit such extreme attention to, as I mentioned, more than 20 environmental conditions. And so why would they not be sensitive to sounds and vibrations? Consider these three representative examples. The roots of corn seedlings emit and register clicking sounds at particular frequencies, most likely as part of their underground communication strategies or probing for underground water sources. Flowering plants exhibit strong reactions to buzz pollination, releasing their pollen in response to buzzing sounds, even when no actual insects are present in lab conditions. So if a plant is blossoming, is flowering, and in a lab you play a sound recording of buzzing insects to it, it will activate a mechanism that will release its pollen to facilitate pollination. Leaf vibrations resulting from herbivore chewing prompt adaptive or defensive responses by the affected plant, as well as other plants to which the threat is biochemically communicated. And here again, in lab conditions, you can simply play the sounds of an insect chewing on a leaf, and a plant that hears those sounds will activate its adaptive responses, its defensive responses. For instance, releasing volatile biochemicals to repel the insect in question. So plants are all ears. Perhaps we should also hear this idiomatic expression literally. The functional equivalent of human and animal ears is not localized in one particular structure of vegetal anatomy. It is dispersed throughout the entire plant, which listens with its entire body to its whole environment. Plant listening is, in this sense, a bit like thinking uncoupled from the brain, if not the central nervous system, and diffused throughout the body. Now, because vegetal ears do not have a specific site, they overlap with the plant's lungs and mouths, eyes and skin. All ears, the plant is all eyes and all thinking, all vibrant and vibrating with life in every part, because, of course, the leaves also have photosensitive cells. They are also engaging in exchange of gases, they are breathing, and they are the surfaces that register all of these vibrations and auditory stimuli from the environment. Second, our listening to plants. This, of course, has been an unmitigated failure. With the exception of certain poetic insights and the budding, though still quite small, field of plant bioacoustics. And here the work of Monica Gagliano, an Italian researcher who works in Australia, is really pioneering the field of plant bioacoustics. With the exception of these instances, the human consensus on the silence of vegetation has been overwhelming. We take the fact that plants lack recognizable ears and an apparatus for generating sounds akin to ours or to that of animals who are similar to us, for evidence of their muteness and absolute deafness, sheltered from the very possibility of hearing. We, who without giving it a second thought, subscribe to such a view, judge plants in advance. We prejudge them. And it is this prejudice that deafens us. So by thinking prejudicially that plants are deaf, we actually deafen ourselves to what they have to say, in a sense. For too long, vegetal hypersensitivity has slipped through the cracks of our crude perceptual and cognitive systems. In 2019, this failure of discernment is no longer excusable. And third, the resonance of human and vegetal auditory attentions has been consequently fraught and doubly asymmetrical. While plants co-vibrate with us and with the rest of the world, we do not. While they are all ears, we have only two, which, to add insult to injury, are unable to pick up the bioacoustic signals emanating from plants. Just as plant thinking requires the ongoing work of reconfiguring and transfiguring the symbiotic relation between human thought and vegetal existence, so the attunement of human listening to that of plants needs to be patiently refined, finessed. How? And with these ruminations on how we can adjust our listening to the listening of plants, I will be concluding these remarks. I propose that we learn to listen with our entire bodies, rather than exclusively with the ears. So we should also be all ears in this sense, that the whole body listens. In fact, it would be a matter of merely discovering something that is inconspicuously there, as opposed to acquiring a new skill. It would then be a matter of laying bare the repressed vegetality of our own bodies and psychic strata. Vibrations do not strike the ear alone. They affect every material medium and are ready to be picked up by any sentient surface. The first sentient surface of our bodies is the skin, and it turns out that its vibrations convey information to the brain in this way similar to the auditory system. So the skin vibrates, and those vibrations are conveyed to the brain in a way that is very similar to what the ears do. The skin, I would add, is probably our most vegetal organ, breathing through its pores like a leaf, sensing light without being an eye, hearing vibrations without being an ear. It's like we're wrapped in this gigantic leaf, in a sense. And by the way, I'm trying to do the exact opposite than anthropomorphizing plants. I'm trying to vegetalize people. And not to vegetalize them from the outside, but to show a certain vegetality that is already there and has been repressed over centuries, if not millennia, of Western thought. The scope of what we listen to would also change following the lead of plants. Besides technologically altering the perceptual thresholds within which we typically receive sounds, we would no longer seek speech and song, howling and chirping, hissing and roaring as the indicators of communication that is conflated with vocalization. So to communicate is not just to vocalize. Clicking and buzzing have been heard, sometimes using sophisticated equipment amplifying our bodily capacities. They have been heard as mere noise, but not really listened to. And here the difference between hearing and listening is crucial. The expanded scope of listening entails a painstaking transition from hearing to interpretively attending to sound waves or vibrations which plants either produce or receive as carriers of meaning. And finally, a resonance of distinct modes of listening deserves a close analysis. I'm not talking about the resonance of sonorities, sonorous resonance of plants and humans. I'm talking about the resonance of listening, of modes of listening. It is the resonance of ears or their equivalents, not of voices, which means that it is markedly silent. A vibrant silence permeates plant listening, the silence within which speech initially, incipiently makes sense. Yet the silences resonating in the listening of the plants themselves and in our listening to them have been mutually opposed. One has been pregnant with meaning, the other has blocked the semantic flows emanating from everyone and everything not human. These extremes, moreover, have not been articulated in thought. Sure, there have been and there still are cultures, groups, and individuals who do not fit my description and whose ears and indeed bodies have been exquisitely receptive to the vegetal. Still, their existence does little to interfere with the predominant model of plant listening, featuring the resonance of all and nothing, of vivacious openness and austere closure, of heedful excess and the dearth of attention. And so a goal to aspire toward should not be carving out exceptional niches of acoustic sensitivity within the mainstream deafness to plants, but rather turning the cultural tide of ontological neglect, of what I call the ontological neglect of plants. Not pricking up our ears and picking the previously inaudible signals plants send, but intervening in the interactive or interpassive architecture of plant listening. Thank you for your attention and for listening.